If you're planning to give a successful media interview for your beautiful children's book, or any book for that matter, where both the host and listeners will remember you and your message way beyond the interview, then this video is for you. This is part 3 of my short podcast for writers series, and while this is specifically about podcast interviews, what I'm sharing today will help you prepare for your interview on any media outlet. This will help you stick out from all the other interviews a listener may be listening to. Hi there, I'm Eevi, an award-winning children's author and ghostwriter over on eevijones.com and the creator of Children's Book University. I create videos specifically for children's authors, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss my weekly videos. In the first part of this series, we looked at why going on podcasts can be so beneficial to us and our children's book, what podcasts to seek out, and where to find these podcasts. In the second part of the series, we looked at what parameters to look out for when deciding what podcast to pitch to and how to successfully draft and pitch our outreach message to ask to be interviewed. That's such an important step because if outreach messages don't speak to the podcast host, then we won't be invited to be interviewed, right? So the way we draft this message is really important. If you haven't watched these first 2 parts yet, I've added the links in the description below, so make sure you watch that as well. The third part is entirely dedicated to looking at what 5 important things we will want to do and prepare before the interview to make it a truly successful and memorable one. I will also have some of my best interview-related ninja tips sprinkled throughout the video, so let's jump right in. After we have been invited to come on for an interview, there are a number of things we will want to prepare well before the interview. Some of these we only have to prepare once, which we can then reuse for future interviews, either the way they are or by slightly tweaking them or customizing them depending on the interview. Number 1 during our preparation phase is to listen to more episodes of the podcast we are about to appear on. In the previous video, I already mentioned to make sure to listen to at least 1 episode before we approach any given podcast host in order to be able to personalize our initial outreach message and also to see if the podcast is even a good fit. Now that we have been invited to come onto the podcast, we will want to listen to even more episodes. The goal for us is to 1, stick out to the listener of the podcast, and 2, to also stick out and be memorable to the host in a good way. By listening to more than 1 episode, we'll be able to determine if there's some sort of pattern or if the host has a particular interview style. For example, are there questions that the host likes to ask all their guests, or are all the questions different depending on the guest? How much space or time does the host give their guests to answer a question? Are they looking to inform or simply entertain their audience? And do they provide their guests with an opportunity to share how to reach out to you if the listener wishes to do so? Identifying these things can be really helpful because if a host, for example, likes asking the same questions, we can already prepare what our answers would be. And even if they use different questions, this will help us anticipate what type of questions they might be asking. And knowing and understanding what the host's main goal is when they are interviewing their guests is really helpful because that would help us with how we would phrase our answers. For example, by listening to a podcast that I was invited to, I realized that the hosts like to share a 1 or 2 sentence summary every time a guest gave a long response to their questions. And he liked to do so to really highlight the main points or takeaways for his audience. And so knowing that the interviewer liked to do that, I went ahead and prepared my own summary, which I then shared right after each of my own responses. He told me after the interview that he never had any other guests do that before. And because I essentially did all the quote-unquote work for him during the interview, he was free to insert more personal things during the episode, which he usually didn't do because his interview style was to ask all his guests the same questions. And so I believe that him being able to share a little bit more about himself during the interview set our episode apart from all the other episodes he had recorded up to this point. And of course, by listening to more episodes, we get to know the host a bit better as well, which in turn gives us an opportunity to find little things about them that we can then tie into our own answers to connect even further with the host. For example, before one of my interviews, I learned that the host used to be in the military. So I made sure to mention during the interview that my family used to be a military family as well, which in turn made me instantly more relatable to the host. This can be so powerful and can change the entire dynamic of an interview. So be sure to listen to those little clues and then use them during your interview. So takeaway number 1 is to listen to previous episodes and to then use what you have learned and apply it during your own interview. Number 2, during our preparation phase, is to prepare a guest bio. A guest bio is often quite similar to our author bios. So if you need help writing or tweaking yours, I went ahead and added a link to a separate video in the description below that is all about the drafting of our author bio. Now, hosts often introduce their guests at the beginning of their show, and so that is what they would use our guest bio for. And if they add show notes to each of their podcast episodes, then this is what they would add our guest bio to as well. Based on episodes you previously listened to, you should be able to tell how short, long, or detailed the interviewer's guest introduction usually is. So you will want to prepare your guest bio accordingly. Now, sometimes the host will simply go and grab that guest bio from places like your website if you have one. But if you can, I would encourage you to prepare this guest bio yourself, because preparing the short guest bio ourselves can be really beneficial because we can tailor it to the podcast's audience based on their own likes and interests. In our guest bio, we will essentially want to share and mention things that would help us instantly establish some sort of connection to the audience or a level of credibility in the eyes of the listener, because that's what would make them want to listen to us and be open to our message that we are about to share during the interview. And we can always do so more easily by showing similarities we may have to the audience or with the audience, and by sharing credibility markers that the audience might be aspiring to as well. For example, if I know the podcast's audience is mostly made up of moms, my guest bio will mention that I am a mom, and will be drafted in such a way that emphasizes the family side of things a bit more. If, on the other hand, I'm invited to a podcast where the audience is mostly made up of writers, then I'd make sure to mention that I'm a USA Today best-selling writer and an award-winning children's author. And if I'm invited to a podcast that is mostly for entrepreneurs, I would mention that I have my own business, where I would make sure to mention the name Children's Book University, and that I have appeared in places like Forbes, and that I'm a ghostwriter for many successful entrepreneurs, and then perhaps even mention a name or two of those entrepreneurs that I feel this particular audience might already know. Because again, this establishes instant credibility right at the beginning of the interview, so the listener of this episode is more likely to stick around for the entire recording. So takeaway number 2 is to draft our own guest bio, because it gives us more control over how we are being introduced during interviews. Number 3, during our preparation phase, is to prepare what is called a CTA, or call to action. I briefly mentioned this in one of the previous videos in the series. A CTA allows us as guests to address the listener by sharing with them what we would like them to do next, be it to invite them to visit our own website by sharing our URL with them, or to invite them to purchase our book by mentioning the book title and where it would be available, or any other action we want them to take. So having an opportunity to share our own CTA with the podcaster's audience is really valuable. And the reason I'm encouraging you to prepare a CTA is because so many of us don't know about its value and importance, because oftentimes people simply say their goodbyes and the interview is over. And that's a really missed opportunity, because the listener just spent many minutes listening to our interview. So prompting them or inviting them to learn more about us is only natural. And this is where my ninja tip number 1 comes in. Besides making sure that we really do prepare something that we can share here with the audience, even if it's just as simple as our website or the title of our book, if you want to go the extra mile, you could create a CTA that is specifically tailored toward the audience of that specific podcast. Very similar to having different versions of our guest bio based on the audience, we can prepare different versions of our CTA. For example, on podcasts podcasts where I go as the founder of Children's Book University, my CTA might be to schedule a free 10-minute chat with me over on Zoom. For that, I would simply share a link to one of my online scheduling links so the listener can schedule a time. Here we'll want to make sure we mention during the interview that it's limited. So during one of my interviews, I said that the first 10 visitors would be able to sign up for this 10-minute chat. And even though this was a very limited CTA, it still brought lots of value to the podcast host because he was able to offer something special to his audience through my offer that I made. If you have an email list, then you could prepare something book specific that you could then mention and offer during the interview. So for example, if your children's book is about teaching kids about hygiene and you're on a homeschooling podcast, then you could create a very simple 2-page lesson plan and then prompt the audience to visit your website where they then would be able to sign up to receive their free gift. I did create a video on how to quickly and easily create book extras like coloring pages and things like that. So I will go ahead and add the link to that video in the description below in case you need help with that as well. So these were just a few ideas if you are looking to create your own podcast specific CTA. Now, something important to note here is that not every interviewer does this. Not every interviewer will automatically offer you an opportunity to share a CTA at the end of the interview. And this is where my ninja tip number 2 comes in. After having listened to a number of a podcast's episodes and you realize that that particular host does not provide their guests with an opportunity to share a CTA, then I would encourage you to be proactive. So before the interview begins, you can simply ask the host if it would be okay to share a gift with their audience at the end of the interview. And if you can say that you prepared this gift specifically for their audience, then more often than not, they'll be delighted to do so because this makes the host look great, right? Because they are able to present their audience with such a wonderful offer or gift through you. So be proactive and simply ask. Number 4 during our preparation phase is to prepare our answers or responses. Now this can be a bit tricky depending on the podcast and the interview style. There are essentially 2 main interview styles. Style 1 is where the interviewer likes to follow a pattern. So here they often have a set of recurring questions they like to ask their guests. So that's another reason why listening to previous episodes will be so important. So make sure to write down the questions the host is asking their guests. This will help us figure out whether or not they tend to ask the same questions. And if that's the case, then we'll want to make sure to prepare an answer to each of these questions. An answer that is both concise but detailed at the same time. Style 2 is where the interviewer likes to draft their questions based on their guest. This requires a bit more preparation on the side of the host. Here I would still go ahead and listen to as many episodes as I can because this will give us an idea of what direction the host likes to take their interviews, which in turn might help us anticipate what kind of questions they might be asking. And while this interview style might be a bit harder to prepare for, it also presents us with yet another opportunity to stand out from all the other guests. Because what we can do here is we can help the host prepare by providing a list of questions you would like to be asked, or a list of talking points you would like to talk about and cover during the interview. This is great because this also lets us somehow determine the direction we would like the podcast to go in, right? So if you have a very specific question you really want to be asked during the interview, you can certainly share this list with them in a respectful email beforehand. Alternatively, you can of course also reach out and ask the host directly if they would be able to provide you with a list of questions beforehand. If you state that you would like to prepare as much as possible so that you can provide their audience with as much value as possible, hosts are usually very accommodating and might be able to provide you with a list. But I would recommend only to ask for such a list if the host is using interview style 2, because if they use interview style 1, where they always tend to ask the same questions, and you then ask them for a list of questions, they will know that you don't listen to their podcast. So be mindful of that. And this is where my ninja tip number 3 comes in. This is an amazing one that will instantly take your interview to the next level. When you're preparing your answers, do so through the eyes of that podcast's particular audience. What does that mean? It means we will want to answer any question from an angle that would be most interesting to that particular audience. For example, if I am a guest on a podcast with mostly moms as their audience, and I am asked what caused me to write my first children's book, my response would come from the perspective of a mom. And I would share how my son had a hard time transitioning from his potty chair to the regular toilet, and that he had a hard time finding a book on that topic, which is why I decided to write my own. If I'm asked the exact same question for a podcast where the audience consists mostly of male entrepreneurs, then I already know this perspective of my story might not resonate with the majority of the listeners. And so knowing this, I simply prepare a slightly different response. The story is still the same. I'm just telling it from different perspectives, emphasizing different aspects of it. And so sharing my response from the perspective of each particular audience makes my story or response instantly more relatable and therefore more relevant. And finally, number 5 of our preparation phase is to practice, because the more we practice, the more confident we will sound. And here I'd even go so far as suggesting to practice your responses out loud so you can actually hear what you sound like. Here we'll want to focus on preparing and practicing concise responses. Even if we are telling a story, we can prepare and practice telling it in a way that is interesting, valuable, and relevant to the audience. Here we could challenge ourselves by asking how we can say the most with the least number of words, and certainly with the least number of filler words. This is again very similar to what I'm sharing in the separate author bio video, because just like with our author bio, we want to be able to convey a lot with a little. Over time, we'll also want to incorporate and consider previous hosts' responses, reactions, or feedback. For example, if an interviewer really liked one of my responses and asked a number of follow-up questions, I can then practice incorporating my responses to these follow-up questions so that next time I'm on an interview, I can give a fuller, more detailed response because I already know that this resonated with previous hosts. My ninja tip number 4 is something I personally like doing when preparing for an interview, and that's to look at what the average episode length of that podcast is, and then prepare and practice my responses within the limits provided by that average length. That way I can kind of gauge how much time I can spend on each of my responses, but that's just a little extra tip that has really helped me a lot over the years. Now, if this sounds like a lot, don't worry. A lot of it can be done by simply listening to a few of that podcast's episodes. And we can do so while doing other things like doing the laundry, taking out our trash, or driving in the car. And once you have given 3 or 4 interviews, you will have very much crafted your very own perfect set of responses. So any interviews that you go on after that will require much less preparation. So the more work we put into this now, the better our interviews will be, and the easier it will be to prepare for any other interviews that will follow, because all we have to do is tweak our responses to tailor them to any given audience. Chances are that the best interviews you've ever listened to were those where the guests were prepared and practiced a lot, especially if they were new to giving interviews. We want to respect and honor the host's invitation to have us on their show, right? We want to honor the listeners' time they spend listening to us, and we want to honor ourselves by making the most out of these wonderful opportunities. And by preparing for our interviews, we do just that. The podcasting world is a beautiful one with so many amazing opportunities, so I am really looking forward to the next part in this series to help you make podcast interviews be part of your marketing strategy for your beautiful children's book. I hope you found this video really helpful to prepare for your interviews. Stay tuned for part 4. In the meantime, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't yet. It really encourages me to keep making free videos for you just like this one. Here's to your fantastic, memorable responses, so that both the host and the listeners remember you and your message way beyond the interview. Bye.